implementation of the recommendations. But it's been nearly 2.5 years now from the time that we launched the final report. But there were a number of occasions where we heard from officials that they were attempting to take things forward, but unfortunately that it never had any outcome. We rarely had follow-up to some of the discussions, and there weren't that many because there were long periods of time where nothing happened, and there was no contact with me or indeed with the victims and survivor organisations about what should happen or our opinion on how to take things forward. Now, I proposed at one stage, I think it was in May or April or May 2023, that there should be a small grouping formed to follow up, to act as a monitor, if you like, on what was happening. And I wrote to the Chief of Staff in Number 10 and also to the Home Office about this idea. It didn't have to be expensive. We'd just meet regularly and check what was happening. I got no response, and I also it was suggested to me I should discuss it with the Home Secretary at the time, when it was prior to the final printed account of the government's response, and I did raise it with her, and she was very vague and nothing further was heard, and indeed, as I recall it, nothing further was heard at all by myself until the next Home Secretary came along, and that was later in the year when Mr. Cleverly was appointed, and I wrote to him saying perhaps we could reset this relationship and try to move things forward. And he was very amenable, and we did have a couple of meetings with him, and he attended an event in January of last year that we organised here to try to raise interest in this. I just wanted to mention one other aspect of all of this. In the end of May, after we'd seen the published response of government, myself and the 3 panel members from the original inquiry wrote to the Times newspaper saying how upset and distressed so many people were after all this time and all the energy, and the response felt disingenuous. It appeared to promise something, and in fact there was no substance to it. So that was our public statement of what we felt about what had happened. I was on holiday, and I had a call from, or I had a message that somebody wanted from the Home Office wished to talk to me about how we could take the recommendations forward, and I thought that's great. Well, maybe this is a chance. This was in June. We'd sent the letter to the Times in May, and what then happened, which I thought was improper, was a special advisor came on demanding to know why I had written to the Times, and complained, and I was very clear that I was not accountable to this person as an independent chair for any actions at all. And I did have ideas about how we could take things forward if they were willing to listen. So that was not a happy experience either, of engaging and trying to push for these recommendations, which are much needed to go forward. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question, but I think it's important to say that we were not sitting back throughout this period of time. We were constantly trying to get political attention to the fact that these recommendations had not been acted upon. And of course, it's one of the biggest weaknesses of the public inquiry system. It's wonderful for establishing truth, etc. But the big weakness is there's no provision for structured monitoring of whether or not there is action taken, verification of that action as part of the whole system afterwards.
Thank you. very much. I think you actually answered my next two questions. That was brilliant. But I just wanted to be clear, that was the extent of your engagement with the Home Office following the publishing of the report.
Yes, I have a note of the different dates here that were relevant. I think I've probably covered them all. Yeah. I should say, of course, this has changed as well since the general election, and indeed in advance, apart from Mr. Cleverly attending the event in January, Jess Phillips also attended it, and they were supportive. But there was one recommendation that was going to be acted upon, which was a version of mandatory reporting, but it was a kind of inadequate version of mandatory reporting, which had some problems with it. However, it was the only one, and that fell with the Criminal Justice Bill when the election was called.
Jake Richards.
Thank you. The account of your communications with the Home Office over the period from October 20 is pretty shocking, actually. And I just wondered, I've got two questions sort of flowing from that. One's quite broad, and you may not feel that's appropriate to answer, but what was going on here? I mean, you've set out a number of recommendations. It was clearly a time of political chaos, a number of Home Secretaries which you've touched upon. But Suella Braverman came to what is now my constituency, met with survivors during that period as Home Secretary. I mean, was it that there was a lack of bandwidth in the Home Office, that they were concentrating on other things, or was it disagreement as to substantive policy, or what was going on? And then just secondly, of course, as you've pointed out, your inquiry in 2020 made a number of recommendations, as it did throughout, and they were, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, but explicitly rejected by the government, 6 of those then. What communication did you have around those as well?
Well, I can only say in relation to the Home Office, and John may have something different to say, we were aware and made aware by officials that the interdepartmental aspects of any of the recommendations, and they were considerable. I think there were 5 or 6 departments that needed to be involved in decision making, if that's the right way to put it. But there was not a lot of support for the recommendations, and that part of that problem was disagreement, or in that bit of process where they're required to get sign-off. And the officials, I think, were very frustrated by that. But John, you may have something different.
That's right. I mean, to be fair to the Home Office, only 4 of their final report recommendations really related to them, so there would need to be broad cross-government agreement to the implementation of all 20, and that clearly wasn't happening. I mean, we only saw the tip of what was happening, but it was clear that it was not proving possible for the Home Office to get the agreement to other departments to launch a cohesive response to the report.
So just for a follow-up question. Is it your view then that actually, you said you wrote to Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister in 2023 that this has to be led by Downing Street, as it's so cross-departmental? And did you make any further attempts to engage with other officials in Downing Street, if not the Prime Ministers themselves?
No, I didn't. There was a point of contact because the person concerned had shown quite a lot of interest in the inquiry and had asked me to. I did indeed make quite a supportive comment about it when the announcement was made about mandatory reporting, but we didn't know the detail of it fully at that stage. But nevertheless, anything was better than nothing in some ways, because we had heard absolutely nothing about the other recommendation, except there was rejection of one I personally felt very strongly about, was the cessation. There should be a cessation of pain compliance in custodial institutions where there were under 18-year-olds, and that was rejected outright.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Professor Jay. You've set out your engagement with the Home Office over the years, and I wonder, was there any time under any Home Secretary or any Home Office Minister where you were advised that the scope of your inquiry was either too broad for the recommendations to be implemented, or too narrow, specifically on grooming gangs? Did anyone ever intimate to you either before or after publication it was too broad?
No, not too narrow, of course. I think that, well, I already said it, but the width of it was a benefit for the reasons I've mentioned earlier. But I personally, because of the nature of being a chair, I did not engage directly with the political side of it. You have to be very... Fairness is really important as the chair of a public inquiry and objectivity. But there was no communication of that time.
Did anyone ever say to you at any point during this that a second inquiry might be required?
No, absolutely not.
So there have been obviously a lot of calls for that recently. When did you first hear of a call for second inquiries into this issue?
Well, probably the same time as you did, but it was as a consequence of the general discussion in the public domain about, I don't particularly use the term grooming gangs and never have, not even when I was doing the work in Rotherham, but what we call organised networks, absolutely not. I've never heard of any of it.
Okay, so over 7 years and 7 Home Secretaries, the first call for a second inquiry was late last year?
Yes, that's
Okay,
that's
thank
right.
you.
Just place on record first that I was the leader of Telford Region Council, and the inquiry was going to come to Telford, didn't come to Telford, and we set up a local inquiry, which is now being seen by others as a good standard of a local inquiry. Also, I'm a former chair of the Local Government Association. Just taking you back to the recommendations and publishing the recommendations, I take your point, you did it in stages. Did you have any conversations with any other ministers, cabinet ministers or other ministers, around the implementation of those recommendations, taking on board that, as you say, not all of them relate to the Home Office?
No, I think it was very clear legally that in the role I was in, it was not for me to negotiate such things with the political dimension in any way. It really was. Now, I cannot say that I wasn't familiar with some of their views, because obviously people in the inquiry, John and others, must engage. John was the secretary and the accounting officer, and you do have some engagement around what's your views about this or that, but not politically.
On the recommendations as well?
Well, I mean, you need to speak for yourself. I personally had no engagement, and that was considered to be the proper position for a chair to be in of a public inquiry.
Mr O'Brien, yourself?
No, so you certainly had no discussion about recommendations, because I think that's a line that shouldn't be crossed. The recommendations should flow from the evidence that the chair and the panel heard. After the final report was finalised within the inquiry, we obviously started talking to departments that there were recommendations that would go beyond Home Office borders, if I can put it like that. But it would have been entirely improper to tell people what those recommendations were. The whole point of publication was to make sure that they were in the public arena at the same time as they were.
So, Professor Jay, for you to have a phone call from a special advisor within the government about your press and media comments, expressing frustration about the lack of action, can you say a little bit more about that conversation and what the purpose of the conversation was from your perspective?
Yes, and I first, as I say, I was on holiday at the time, and I got an email message saying this person wants to set up a meeting with you, and I contacted the secretary who was involved and said, what's the purpose of the meeting? And was told that it was to discuss the next steps in the recommendations and the implementation of the recommendations.
Was that the conversation that you had?
Well, it was a non-conversation, because the starting point was, why did you write to the Times?
And what was the tone of that conversation? Was it a genuine curiosity about why you'd gone public, or a desire to want to work together to implement the recommendation? What was your perspective?
I don't want to make too much of this, but it was definitely adversarial.
Okay.
clear, it was after the recommendation, so it wasn't a special advisor getting involved during the inquiry.
No, it was after the government's formal position had been published. And that's the point at which, as I referred to earlier, that I and my 3 colleagues who were panel members decided we'd write and say, you have let down so many people by this response and by the lack of specificity about what needs to be done. Indeed, there was hardly any.
Did that conversation lead to any effective change in terms of the government's approach around recommendations?
No. In fact, it led to quite a long silence. That conversation took place at the first 2 weeks, sometime in the first 2 weeks in June. And the next contact I personally had was, well, I made it. I wrote to Mr. Cleverly and said perhaps we could reset this. I was continuously thinking that somebody surely will get in touch to take some of this forward. It didn't happen. And I wrote to them and got a very quick response in late November, December of the same year. But in the intervening months, nobody from the inquiry had any contact. The inquiry, of course, didn't exist at that stage because it closed on the 31st of March. So, but nevertheless, there's plenty of scope for everyone would know how to be in touch.
Would you be able to provide the committee with a timetable, a written timetable of that contact, just for our use later on?
It's pretty well as do you want me to? You will have recorded it, will you?
We don't need that.
No, I think it's fine. But just to be absolutely clear, so it would be inappropriate for ministers to have interfered while all special advisors while the inquiry was ongoing.
Yes.
So you wouldn't expect to have had any contact. But once you'd finished and the recommendation had been published, you feel that there was insufficient contact from ministers and responses until quite recently, and we'll come on to that.
Yes,
Yeah,
I do think that. I don't think there's much scope for disagreement about
that's
it.
fine. I just wanted to be absolutely clear. Ben McGuire wanted to ask something.
Thanks for coming into the committee today. I just wanted to follow up on some of my colleagues' questions there. I just find it absolutely shocking that you don't seem to have had any engagement, not just with the Home Office, but other government departments when you've been set up as an independent inquiry to look at these and make recommendations. I'm just totally shocked by that, and I just wonder what your view is in terms of not only not having any engagement with the Home Office and other departments, not seemingly having any support to implement your recommendations. Why do you think that was? Is it cost pressures? Is it difficulties implementing them, practically speaking? What's your view on that?
I've never really fully understood it because we were meticulous in the evidence gathering. We were very confident that the basis for the recommendations we made was solid. We were aware, of course, some, like redress, would inevitably involve one-off money, but quite a lot of one-off money, as you know from other inquiries. But what I didn't expect was a complete silence. And it wasn't just with us, as you know, the inquiry didn't exist anymore, but it was also with victims and survivors as well. I wouldn't say all of them, by the way, but some of the organisations we were in touch with, that nothing was happening.
Can I just add something to that? I think it's a fundamental fault with the inquiry process. We need to be clear, this story that you're hearing won't be unique to ICSA. There will be other inquiries, I'm sure, that all have had a similar experience to this. And it is because the minute the chair writes the letter to the relevant minister saying I've now completed, everything stops. So there is no apparatus in place for the inquiry to be influential. It's really interesting that in the individual investigation reports we published as we went along, which had recommendations in, we ran a process where after 3 months we would write to the relevant organisation, very often a government department, asking what was happening. We'd repeat that process at 6 months and we'd repeat it at 9 months, and we'd published all those letters on our website. Over 80% of those interim recommendations were implemented, and I don't think those two things are disconnected.
Margaret Mullane.
John and Professor Jay both kind of focused in, following on from Ben's question, on the strategic positioning on safeguarding, where the focus shifts, which is a problem, and the leadership needs to be there to keep the safeguarding and child sexual abuse at top of the agenda, especially as what you'd said earlier with the victims. I just wonder, do you think that's possible?
In which context, I'm sorry?
Where kind of something happens and then there's the focus is gone. You both kind of highlighted that.
Yes, indeed. Well, for the same reasons as John's saying, it's the public inquiry system is very strong. Its purpose initially is to get to the truth of what happened, but it's not prosecutorial. No. You can name names, which we did in many reports of people who had failed, but it will not. It really is for police investigation in many instances to follow through on, and in some instances, of course, that simply wasn't possible because it was too long in the past before they would do it. But in a general point, the leadership and the culture of organisations in relation to child sexual abuse is hugely important. And certainly I learned that lesson, well, I always knew it, of course, but I was 30 years in local government, but in Rotherham, when I wrote the report there, the political attitude to some of those issues was extremely important and negative.
Because you make reference then that it kind of switched to county lines at that point, both of you, didn't you?
Oh, you mean yes, indeed. Sorry about to child criminal exploitation.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
The focus did change to that, and indeed at the beginning, way back in the 2000s, I know this obviously from the work in Rotherham because we looked at what had happened in the past. It was child sexual exploitation was just seen as another. Not necessarily grooming, a gang response to the street price of heroin and needing to find other business outlets for criminality, if you like. That was fairly shocking. But then, of course, you're quite right, later county lines came along. But we were aware in Rotherham, and I wrote about this in the report, that the specialist police were excellent, were very good, who knew something and were properly trained in CSE, but going back 10 years, the general impression was not of that police force, or wider perhaps. They did prioritise car crime and housebreaking, important as they are, but somehow or other they were always more important, it appeared, than the welfare of children and the appalling abuse that was going on there. And it might have been quite widespread at the time. But the specialist police were excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Jay, what I think I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that not only was there a failure to implement, but actually the extent to which there was agreement to adopt the recommendations was all in rhetoric terms, and actually there was no real cross-government agreement on these recommendations. So in reality, the practice, the rhetoric and the reality there was quite a divide. Would you agree with that?
That was what we were led to believe by officials at the time.
So if officials told you that although government was publicly saying that they would adopt the recommendations, in reality there was some concern about the recommendations themselves?
Perhaps one example I could give you is mandatory reporting.
Yes.
The Department for Education were not keen on that.
Okay.
For example, but it's nothing necessarily to do with the intrinsic value of the recommendations. We understood it was a more pragmatic response that teachers wouldn't stand for it, or this was never told directly. That we were told of this at the time by officials. that's not the same as saying it's a bad thing. It's just saying, oh, it's too difficult to do, or it's we don't want to get into a row with trade unions over this, or etc. etc. You know, there's a subtle difference there.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Jay and Mr. O'Brien. Two questions, one process, one detail. You paint a pretty shocking picture of inaction, almost active inaction. You submit your report, the initiative goes to the government, a few kind words, you try to express your disquiet quietly, nothing happens. You go to the press, you're slapped down. You both referenced this in passing, but how should the public inquiry process change so that we don't have governments just sitting on these things? How would you change the process?
Well, I think it's probably one of the biggest questions facing the public inquiries, and it's good that it is being aired, because it's, from my perspective, it's the biggest weakness is the lack of follow-up and monitoring built into the process. Not necessarily those in the public inquiry only. Then clearly not. It should be but there should be more of a process and an independent process that should involve the key beneficiaries, or however you would like to describe them, of the recommendations of it as well. And there needs to be something more than what we have just now, because you can see nearly 2.5 years later, there will be action. I assume, of course, that will take place. It won't be some of these things that take a while to implement. But some could be done, and indeed in the conversation with the special advisor, I listed the areas that could be done without primary legislation. So in other words, it could be done quite quickly. And there were, I think, 4 or 5 that were possible to take forward. We knew that the Parliament at that time was running out of time for primary legislation, but do something, make a commitment. Should they have been re-elected, make a commitment that in the next Parliament these will be a priority. That was the kind of thing we were looking for. But in many ways it shouldn't have been for us to try to resolve that problem. It should have happened. But John, you have views on the public inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on what Alexis said there, of course, in the year or two either side of us, there were other major inquiries reporting as well. So what you have is an environment when inquiries that were set up for all sorts of reasons, you never know at the beginning, of course, how long they're going to take. So you do sometimes get a concentration of inquiries or reporting at once. Many of the recommendations require primary legislation, and you'd require a clear parliamentary timetable for 4 years to get them all implemented, even if nothing else happened. So there needs to be some sort of monitoring process to make sure that there's oversight that can advise government on how you implement not just ICSAs, but what are the important ones that you need to implement to solve the biggest problems in all the areas that inquiries looked at. But I personally feel also that we need to get the balance right also between national statutory inquiries and non-statutory inquiries. I've seen really effective non-statutory inquiries, and very often you'll hear people say, well, they can't compel evidence, but sometimes we don't give it a try. You could actually have a non-statutory inquiry that goes along very successfully taking evidence, and indeed we've had examples of that. Hillsborough was an example of that. So I just think we need to get that balance right, because the minute you make it statutory, you introduce processes which increase cost and time automatically. And we need to focus on what is the problem we're trying to solve. Is it local or is it very specific? And would a non-statutory inquiry do the job before you consider the statutory process? Because the statutory process does include legal processes and all sorts of other requirements that just extend cost and time. But the biggest failure of the whole system is the failure to have an independent oversight, in my view, of the recommendations, because we'll shortly be having other inquiries reporting, Post Office, for example, and you'll just have more and more recommendations requiring, in many cases, primary legislation going into a pot where the government agenda going forward already is taken up a large part of the parliamentary timetable. We need to have an honest conversation with people about that. We need somebody to honestly say, we're doing these ones first and this is why.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I'm sure we'll take that up as a committee. Now, my question of detail: before the whole issue hit the headlines again in December, what conversations, dialogue did you have with the new government in the period before that?
Well, as I said earlier on, Ms Phillips attended the event that we had and spoke at it in January of last year. And I think we had a discussion in September, was it? With herself and with colleagues who are behind me here from the Survivors Trust and a lawyer who was also part of the campaign was present. So we had a discussion at the beginning of September. Now, obviously, the new government had a lot to do, so we didn't. We weren't quite sure how things would proceed from there. But was that the last time that we had a?
It was the last time we had a formal meeting before the one last week. But
yes, we had one last week, of course.
But there were positive signs coming out that there was a commitment to try and get things done.
Mm-hmm.
So with the new government, you went to them and reminded them of the report, or did they come to you, or how did it happen?
Well, I think we probably approached them because we thought, well, here's another option. You know, let's see if we can follow
the current situation. So I just want to bring Jake Richards in.
Just moving back a bit to what Paul called the active inaction, I think, which is a good phrase, from 2022 October onwards. I just wondered, both of you worked on this for 7 years, gave up a huge amount of your time, and perhaps even more importantly, survivors gave evidence. How does it make you feel, and if you've had conversations with them, how does it make them feel when you compare that period of inactivity and a lack of engagement with what we've had over the last 2, 3, 4 weeks, where some of the same politicians, the Chief of Staff, who I think is now in the House of Lords, who didn't respond to you, are calling for another inquiry, is calling for the government to take immediate action after a period of essentially 18 months of inaction. I just wondered if you could share with us how that makes you feel professionally, and perhaps some of the survivors who I know you'll know very well, how it makes them feel.
The overriding concern is just get it done, to be honest, at this point. And why I did a huge number of requests for media interviews, etc. And I really felt very concerned at the weaponisation, if you like, of child sexual abuse that has gone on. And I declined to make, and I won't make any comment about the various actors involved in that. I wouldn't give them the oxygen of publicity. But just please, it was such a relief, by whatever means, we wouldn't have chosen it necessarily to have come about in this way. But we just need to get on with it. And we are assured of a timetable by the end of February. But it was a relief more than, whoops of joy.
Yeah.
Paul Keller.
When you were last before the committee, you said the 3 most important recommendations were mandatory reporting, a redress scheme and a child protection authority.
Yes.
Do you still think those are the 3 most important recommendations?
I've heard nothing to say that or heard no evidence that would suggest otherwise. I mean, the rest are very important as well, and I would continue to have those 3 as the most important ones. But I have no illusions that they wouldn't. Each of them take quite a bit of time. They're not going to be easily addressed. Although for example, in redress, we had an enormous amount, and we had a thematic investigation in the inquiry into accountability and reparations, and amassed an enormous amount of material internationally and elsewhere more locally, if you like, from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, but also from Australia and Canada and anywhere else, was relevant to redress. So a lot of the work was done to set up such a scheme. There will almost certainly be funding, but that should be implemented, and it doesn't require a great deal more investigation or research in order to do it, in my opinion. But there are, obviously, we were concerned, mandatory reporting is hugely important, and for the reasons that I think everyone will know, that this, more than anything else, this was the response we got from victims and survivors when we asked them, and many of them, of course, a very significant number, over 7,000, but by far the majority have asked what would have made a difference to your experience, and it's if there had been a trusted adult that they could approach, knowing with confidence that they would do something about it. But what happened in so many cases that we heard about was they plucked up the courage to talk to somebody, and it didn't stop. The abuse didn't stop, and they believed that this adult was going to do something, and they did nothing. And that must have been devastating for children.
The Home Secretary, in her statement last week, said they're going forward with 3 recommendations, one of which was mandatory reporting. The other two were making grooming an aggravating factor, and data collection, the way data is collected. Do you agree with those as being other priorities that should be taken forward, or were there better ones?
Well, I think those were the ones the Home Office could take. Well, no, actually, that's not the aggravating factor, but certainly the data set. I know it always sounds nerdy, but it's so hugely important. And in respect of the subject that's been most under discussion, child sexual exploitation, we know that's not going to be able to be done very quickly, because police forces all have different styles of classification, if indeed they monitor anything that's relevant, but the descriptors they use are not the same across all of the police forces. So to get an accurate picture of the problem of child sexual exploitation, the baseline across the board needs to be consistent, and it isn't just now. And that it's hugely important that that's fixed if we are to gain an accurate picture of where there are very serious problems that need to be addressed. So we did recommend, of course, a core data set, and that I absolutely believe that in the importance of that.
Making grooming an aggravating factor wasn't in your final report, it was in one of the subsidiary reports.
That's the same one, that's correct.
Yeah.
That's right.
Why didn't it make it into the final list of 20 recommendations?
Because it was very specific to to child sexual exploitation. We had a set of the final report was never intended to be a collation of the most important from the rest. The only reason we included 6 others that had already been in other investigation reports was because the responses of those who should have been doing it were inadequate. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Is there's no regulation. I find this impossible to believe, really, but it's true. There's no regulation of children's home staff in England, whereas Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have had such a system of regulation in place. I first became a regulated person in 2002. Now, in England, the only regulated people in the social care field are social workers. Indeed, some government or other at some point actually stopped the regulation of social workers in training, which bizarre. I don't know why they did that, but however, in the other 3 countries, there's significant regulation of others, and the priority is nearly always residential children's homes. And of course, we found that they were although it's a decreasing marketplace, if you like, because of the extensive use of foster care and other types of care. But nevertheless, we consider it to be very important that they should be regulated. And that's, we could never understand why that had not happened, because it was 2012 when it was due to be introduced, and it didn't happen.
Do you see marked differences between England and the other nations?
In this respect, yes.
And in the actual practical outcomes that are different because of it?
Oh, I see. I don't know if because it's quite difficult to know, as I've just been saying, about how you count outcomes in these cases. However, you have to do some things because they're the right thing to do, and I consider strongly that this is the right thing to do, is that people who are looking after the most vulnerable in our populations should be properly regulated. And I cannot understand why it's never been done, although and it's only one category at the moment in children's social care, which is the social workers who are regulated. The settings are regulated, but that's an entirely different matter.
And just on mandatory reporting, with Rotherham in particular, what difference would it have made, do you think, if there'd been mandatory reporting at the time?
I'm fairly confident there were so many people that told me that they had tried to tell people, and indeed many of them did tell their senior people. There was a grouping of children, just coming on to it, children's home staff who used to meet regularly and say, how can we deal with this? And we've got all these phone numbers of cars that turn up late at night to pick up usually girls, but not only girls, from children's homes, and they can't lock them in. They can't, that's not how a children's home should operate. But they had no outlet, and nobody was interested in hearing. And certainly there was also evidence of some researchers and others who actually wrote to the Home Office and drew their attention to it. You may not remember all of this, but there was an inquiry into it. And the person concerned was treated very badly when this emerged, and basically they disciplined or attempted to discipline her for having taken actions that she had taken in writing to the divisional commander of police and indeed to the social work, children's social care director about this. That she was punished for it. So there were people who did try, but I have absolutely no doubt that mandatory reporting would have made a difference faster in these circumstances.
I mean, I say this because I was the Minister for Safeguarding from 15 to 16, and I remember meeting the victims. I went to Rotherham, I met the victims, and I sat down with them, and the frustration was we told people and nobody listened to us, and that so it really had resonated with me, and my fear is just that a mandatory report, unless it's acted upon, you've ticked the box, you've done what you needed to do. Certainly I heard that from survivors constantly. It can't just be a report, it has to be something that's actually acted on.
Yes, I think that we, insofar as we started to develop the model, definitely thought there ought to be a designated person who would receive in the police or children's social care or whatever, or people. It wasn't just your own boss.
Exactly.
There needed to be somebody where a degree of protection would be afforded to those who were in effect whistleblowers and complying with the law. But John knows a bit more on this.
So I think mandatory reporting is also important for a different reason. I can't count the number of times in the inquiry that when an institution finally accepted it had sexual abuse of children happening, it immediately closed itself down. And I don't mean literally, I mean there was an enormous pressure from those at the top for everything to be internalised, and that led to a significant number of cases that weren't reported to the police at all, weren't reported to social services at all, perpetrators were simply moved to a different area of the company or whatever it was. So I think mandatory reporting will make a real difference, because it needs to have two stages to it. You need to make sure that people are able to report, and your point, Chair, that the person they report to takes action, but it also needs to make sure there's a disincentive for those at the top of organisations to try and persuade people not to report. And no action can be taken by anybody until that report has been made. And that was such a common problem that in many areas we looked at, the organisations that would have dealt with that report were excellent, but the reports simply weren't getting through to them. So I think it will have a really big impact once the reports actually start being made. I agree, absolutely, there needs to be a structure beyond that, but the first thing we need to do is make sure the right information gets to the right people so the right action can be taken. And the important thing in many of the cases is that on the data is that it isn't very often what would be recorded was abuse, not sexual abuse on the database. The consequence of that is all the doorways to the right services for that child who'd been sexually abused were not opened properly because it was recorded as abuse. So we need to get data recording really accurate. You need to accurately record what it is that's happened so that all the genuinely excellent services that exist in many areas kick into place. So those two things combined, I think, will make quite a significant difference.
And just one thing to add to that is, although we've talked a lot about police and children's social care, there are much bigger settings, if you like, than some of those, where mandatory reporting would make a big difference for the reasons John's saying. And these include religious organisations and other more closed settings where they are not required to adhere to the standards of secular bodies.
Okay. I've got Chris Murray and Jenny Reid, and then we're going to move on from what's happened in the past to where we are today. So, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. In your previous answer, you spoke about how some survivors had gone forward to authorities to make reports and then nothing had happened. Mm-hmm. And I think, we're talking a lot about processes and politics and administrative structures here, but at the heart of this is victims who are the victims of terrible crimes. And delay has costs, not just in terms of what we want to do as a government, but for those people. Can you talk a bit about what it was like for survivors of child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, to give evidence to your committee, what the difficulties that they faced were and how you overcame those, and what impact the lack of progress has had on them?
Oh, well, there are at least one person behind me who could better answer that question for you, because you need to talk to victims and survivors themselves who, as you rightly say, are at the heart of it. I mean, we intended to put them, as indeed Theresa May, as the instigator of this public inquiry, intended that the victims must be at the heart of it, and I hope that we delivered that in various ways, lots of different ways. So there wasn't just one way of doing anything, but perhaps the most significant was something called the Truth Project, where individuals who had been the victims of abuse were invited to come forward confidentially and could have a session with a trained facilitator, usually somebody who was psychologist, social workers, ex-police or whoever, but who had a background and who had additional training for this purpose. And we consider that to be an innovation that was successful and meant a great deal, and we had the most extraordinary range of people who came forward to tell us about their experiences. It was quite shocking, and we published anonymous accounts with the agreement of the individuals every 6 months or so in various volumes from the inquiry, and they are extraordinary. So they're probably the best evidence you could, that's not evidence, but certainly material that I've seen, better than all sorts of research projects as well. But it's in, a lot of it is in their own words. So the Truth Project was hugely significant. I'll only mention a couple of things, but the oldest person that came forward was 84, was it, John?
87.
87. Never spoken to anyone out with his, I think it was his wife and immediate family, but had never actually gone out of his house on his own. Is that correct? Yeah. Since it happened.
So I train to do Truth Project sessions, and this is a really powerful story, but I think it's worth telling. Really careful account. So this was a gentleman in his 80s whose abuse had happened between the ages of 6 and 12 by his local priest. Unusually, his parents had taken his report to them very seriously, reported to the police at the time. But this was in the early 1950s. Nothing happened. The priest was believed. But he came along, and the important point about truth sessions is, for many victims, they do not want to give evidence formally. They don't want to go through that process. So the truth session was a way for them to come and talk to us in a completely informal environment. So he didn't want to give evidence formally. He came to speak to us. And he took great care to tell me quite carefully during the session that he told his parents at the time, he had told his future wife, who he'd married quite young, as soon as they'd got married, that he'd been abused, and he told each of his 3 children when they reached 18 that he'd been abused. And it wasn't until he wrote to me 2 weeks after the session that the relevance of that became obvious to me, because he said, I'd never left the house from the age of 12. I'd either been accompanied by my parents, my wife, or my children. I thought you might like to know that after your session I felt able to leave the house for the first time on my own in 70 odd years. So the impact of people being able to come and share their experience in that way can be quite dramatic. And Alexis alluded to, this was the first time he'd shared it with anybody outside of his family. That was quite common in the Truth Project. So, but you asked how, a little bit about the process. You have to create the right environment. So be careful, the rooms and how we decorated them. You have to create an environment where people feel comfortable to come and talk to you about really quite personal things. But if you do it, it can be a very powerful way to engage with people who don't want to give evidence. Giving evidence at a formal inquiry is a big task to ask anybody to undertake. For a survivor, it can be really quite daunting.
Thank you.
Just one or two other points that came up from all of that many people have a perception of child sexual abuse as being like a one-off event. We discovered that from the Truth Project, the average length of time was 4 years, not one night. 4 years was the average length that they reported to us that the abuse went on for. And the average length of time it took from the individual to tell anybody about it, to disclose it, as we usually say, 26 years.
Thank you very much. That's very powerful. Could I ask about when survivors, one can understand a survivor may feel quite conflicted or ambivalent about engaging with the process, and as you say, you've set out a range of different methodologies for them to engage. If a survivor changes their mind about whether or not they've given you evidence or granted anonymity, what do you think the correct response of an inquiry is in responding to that?
Of course they should agree to it if they change their minds. I don't know if there are legal reasons. I'm well aware that there's some discussion in Scotland at the moment on this issue. But it's not one that we confronted, except for people change their minds. Change their minds, that's fine.
I mean, you asked what you thought the correct process should be rather than perhaps what we did.
Right.
I think if a survivor gives evidence and changes their mind, it usually won't be they change their mind about the evidence, it'll be they change their mind about their name being associated with the evidence. And I think in those circumstances, I think the church should exercise their discretion to grant that anonymity, if you want my opinion.
Okay, thanks very much. And then my final question is, obviously the recommendations that you set out in your inquiry were firstly to help victims of historic child sexual abuse, but also to strengthen our resilience against it happening currently. and obviously it's happening across the UK in every community just now. What is your view of the impact of the delay in implementing your recommendations on current victims of child sexual abuse?
Well, although much of what we did was non-recent, we also, in nearly every case where we were looking, say, at a boarding school or a religious organisation, we checked what was currently the case and what was the current practice. And obviously we would bear in mind how many reports of sexual abuse of children had taken place, not just in the 70s or 80s, but in the last few years as well. So we went out of our way to make sure that it was up to date in that respect. But there has been a significant effect on people. I can't, of course, attribution is a problem, but nevertheless, the delays that have occurred, at least for those who are victims or survivors of abuse, and possibly for young people in the system right now, but certainly for the adult survivors, has been devastating. A lot of anger and some despair and some distress.
Your inquiry collected a significant amount of data from Scotland and Northern Ireland, if I'm correct, and of course you're an academic, you're based in Scotland. To what extent, and I suppose this is speculation, but if I may, the systemic and institutional issues that you identify in the report that leads to the child sexual abuse, do you have any reason to believe that the situation is any better or worse in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and to what extent do you think your recommendations are applicable across the UK? You'll know that there's an ongoing inquiry in Scotland.
Of course, yes, and I know about Northern Ireland as well. But I have absolutely no doubt that people behave in similar ways, both institutionally and both as individual abusers in whatever country. There could be an argument that because of the children's hearing system in Scotland, that it may have been picked up earlier, but I haven't seen any evidence to confirm that that's the case, and it's possible, but I don't think there's any difference at all. There's a difference in context, and some things and some settings are more prominent than others in different countries, but it's my strong view, and I've expressed it in one or two sessions in the Scottish Parliament, that they must take seriously the recommendations. There's a lot of support for that as well. But in particular, issues like mandatory reporting have to be seriously considered. And in terms of the implementation, there should be no complacency in any of the other countries about these matters.
Okay. And on mandatory reporting, I believe the First Minister said last week that it would be considered. Do you envisage any situation where mandatory reporting could justifiably not be adopted? That makes sense.
Well, there's obviously, I don't support this, and that's why we made a statement in what we wrote about mandatory reporting, that there should be no exceptions. But of course, for example, the Catholic Church would say that the seal of the confessional should be an exception. There are other areas, possibly children's confidential helplines, which may have to be considered seriously as well. But I would say that we were very clear that there should be a minimum number of exceptions. But I certainly don't think that the seal of the confessional should be one of them.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to the current day. So thank you for filling us in on the past. I'm going to start with Sean Davis.
Thanks, Sharon. Just with your permission, just on mandatory reporting before I move on to the recent events, so very quickly, I think you said earlier on in your session that the recommendation that the previous government was bringing forward that fell as a result of the general election, that version of mandatory reporting, I think I remembered you saying that that wasn't necessarily the view that you think it ought to have been. Can you just expand very quickly on that?
It concerns, well, this is quite complicated, the issue. John, you probably know this better than I do, but it concerns the protections that are not necessarily afforded to children of 13 and over.
So we recognised in the recommendation for mandatory reporting made in the inquiry that there are consensual relationships between children under 18, but maybe particularly in that 16 to 18 age range. So you have to be careful that you're not making a mandatory report of what everybody accepts is a consensual relationship, because it can lead to all sorts of consequences. Children don't then gain access to all the help they need to have a proper consensual relationship. But to answer your question, I mean, I described it as Swiss cheese. There were so many exceptions that allowed the exercise of discretion by whoever the person who was responsible for making the report should be. It was effectively worthless, if they considered that. So you could have a situation where you had a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old, and if they both said they were in a consensual relationship, it negated the need to make a report.
Thank you. So just to summarise, the version that was being brought forward before the general election, in your opinion, wasn't mandatory enough. There were so many exceptions, it didn't make it mandatory.
Yeah, there were other exceptions, but the biggest exception was around 13 to 18-year-olds.
That's really helpful, thank you. So just turning to recent developments. So July general election, a new Home Secretary. Can you just explain to the committee the contact that you had with the new Home Secretary and Home Office ministers, specifically from July to December of last year?
I referred to the meeting with Ms Phillips as a Safeguarding Minister, which took place in September. And was there another one?
There was a meeting last week.
I'll come on to the meeting last week, if that's possible, in January. But in terms of July to December, one meeting with Minister Phillips.
And the event in Parliament here that was before.
That was January.
That was before the general election.
Yeah.
And in terms of that meeting, did it follow the same sort of settings as the previous attempts that you'd had with the various different Home Secretaries before the general election, in terms of wanting to understand the process of taking your recommendations forward? There
was general discussion, I would say, about it. And of course there were, whilst we were there were 3 other people as well. And it was more general than specific.
Okay. And were you given any assurances that work was underway in regards to the report in that sort of general meeting that you had with Minister Phillips?
Yes, we heard about, again, not specifically about what particular areas of work were underway, but what was referred to was the issue we talked about earlier, which was the discussions with other departments. And as far as we could see, obviously, the Home Office was attempting to coordinate that. I think that's reasonable to say, but that was at quite an early stage.
And did you have meetings from July onwards to December with civil servants or officials, or any conversations with civil servants or officials about where this was on the work programme?
Not using those words. We always asked, so when is it going to happen, and when is anything coming forward? Whoever we were talking to, we would ask that, of course.
And then there was a meeting last week, which you've referred to a number of times. What prompted that meeting with the Home Office?
I don't know what prompted it. I mean, I don't even know. I could guess particularly, because we weren't discussing necessarily the matters that had been in the public domain quite prominently. We were discussing the recommendations and where that was going. It was a long and detailed discussion about the implementation of the recommendations in the report.
So the first meeting last year was with Minister Phillips' general, in terms of the general direction of the work, and the fact that the new government came in, there was a piece of work to be done. January was much more in the specific, in terms of talking about the individual recommendations and the timescale to deliver them. Would that be fair?
January was when we held an event last.
Sorry, forgive me. Last week's meeting.
Oh right, okay. I thought you meant the previous.
Sorry,
January.
this January, isn't it?
All right. Yes. I mean, we weren't aware of whatever the announcements were going to be made. You know, of course, that were quite significant. And on Thursday, was it? Yes. But we were assured that things were moving forward on our recommendations. Is that fair?
I think at the earlier meeting it was obvious the Home Office was seriously engaging with other departments about how you delivered the package of recommendations. I think that was obvious from what was said, that there was active engagement across government to try and get agreement. I think the meeting last week, it was clear that had borne some success because there were conversations about specific recommendations. We weren't told what those were, other than the mention of mandatory reporting. But as Alexis said, a couple of days later, there was an announcement that said we're accepting all of them.
In terms of the progress between those, from July up to and including this month, is there another period of time where you'd seen that rapid progress, or rapid's my word, progress outside of that sort of window from the recommendations being delivered?
And so
did you get a sense that things were moving and underway from the meeting that you had with the Home Office from July onwards?
Well, it was only the September meeting, of course.
And then the meeting last week?
Yeah, and last week was a very specific context.
Okay. And then have you had any meetings with any other Member of Parliament in leadership positions since say Christmas on this issue?
Yes, I met at his request with Ed Davey.
Any other members of Parliament that you've had discussions about this from Christmas onwards?
Sarah Champion? Sarah Champion, whom I knew from Rotherham, of course, but had in mind to run some sort of event for newly elected, by that in the last election is what I mean, MPs to orientate them to the report and its recommendations. But it was all predicated on the fact that they weren't going to be, or they had not been implemented at that stage. So we're not entirely sure where that stands now, but it probably, well, I don't feel the need necessarily to participate in it. If it depends what the focus is.
So just to be clear, from July onwards, you've met Minister Phillips in the one meeting, and then most recently Sarah Champion, Ed Davey, and then the meeting we've already described last week. Mm-hmm. In terms of the meeting last week, were any new commitments made to you?
I suppose yes, there was actually. There was a new commitment of meeting with us regularly to keep us informed, both at official level and ministerial level. And I said personally, I want my expertise to be used. That's, you know, of course I want to be informed, but you know, we're sitting on all this material that we could help with the process, you know, depending on which recommendations we're talking about. But I didn't just want it to be reporting back. I think, and indeed, I'm sure there may be commitments as well around victims and survivors, and I think they would want to be more actively involved.
And then just finally from me on this sort of set of questions, so is there an expectation from your perspective that there will be further follow-up meetings with Home Office ministers and other ministers as appropriate? That's your expectation and
yes.
Assumption that's what will happen as a result of the meeting last week?
Yes, I think we came away with that strong impression, and we'll certainly be following it up.
Thank you.
Can I just add?
Of course, Mr. O'Brien.
For the purpose of completeness, the Home Secretary did join that meeting for part of the meeting, the one last week.
Thank you. So the Home Secretary is also mate.
Yes.
Thank you.
On the September meeting, just to be clear, I think you've intimated Minister Phillips was the initiated that. That's correct, is it? Or was it you going to?
I'm trying to remember the origins. It almost certainly would have begun at some point with us writing and saying, we want to talk to you about this.
Okay. And at that meeting, you felt more confident than you had at your previous meetings with the previous government?
Yeah, there was a definite impression that there'd been more engagement across other departments to try and get, as I said before, a cohesive response to it, because the Home Office can only have responsibility for 4, and so it was clear that there'd been conversations going on that were trying to get agreement across government to deliver a more, say, comprehensive and cohesive package, and that became clearer at the meeting last week. And
that January meeting, the meeting last week, when was that arranged? Was that arranged in the wake of the publicity, or was that already in the calendar?
I'm afraid I can't remember exactly. Was it before Christmas
no,
after?
It was arranged in the wake of the publicity, I think would be the way to describe it.
Thank you. I'm kind of surprised by what you're saying there, Professor Jay and Mr O'Brien, because this issue has received significant publicity over the last couple of weeks. You know, it's been on the front page of newspapers, it's been at the top of the headlines, it's been raised in Prime Minister's questions. Did no parliamentarians from opposition parties reach out to you, given your significant experience and expertise in this, and say, hang on, we've had loads of recommendations, 7 years, and they've not been implemented. Why has this been? Apart from Ed Davey, of course.
No, I cannot. I've been thinking hard, but I'm sure I would have remembered.
No curiosity at all as to what the substance of the delay has been?
I don't remember any contacts. We did Home Affairs Select Committee back in January 23, and we did an Education Select Committee as well around that time. Nothing emerged from that.
No curiosity at all.
The opposition and the shadow Home Secretary? Nothing?
Yeah, well, actually, I did have a meeting, and it was an online meeting with Yvette Cooper, and that would have been in 2023, maybe September.
I've been since July.
Mm-hmm.
That's clear.
Just very quickly, just broadly on this topic, I think one political party have said they're going to set up their own inquiry into, I think, as far as I understand it, into a specific aspect of child abuse. Obviously, as people being heavily involved in a 7-year national inquiry, do you have any comment on the ability or, in fact, appropriateness of a political party undertaking an investigation into these serious criminal activities?
Well, I can't see what's to be gained from it.
I think a political party, I struggle to see how that's independent, but so I think you need to be careful. The expectation of people when you announce an inquiry is going to be independent, is going to take evidence independently. I think that's quite tricky.
And just pressing it one step further, in terms of the effect that could have on survivors, whether they engage with the process or not, do you have any word of caution for people who are setting up these inquiries off the back of what seems to be anyway political rhetoric?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you make a very good point. There is a reason why public inquiries are so expensive. A lot of it is, of course, down to the legal costs. But we did invest a fair amount of money in my inquiry in support to victims, support to witnesses, but also a huge amount to support to victims, because we were well aware of what's often referred to as the triggering aspect of either evidence giving or even just relaying, talking about these experiences that they've had as children, and that it must be handled very, very carefully. And not only that, but of course we had good liaison with Operation Hydrant and the police, and we had very strict rules about referring anything of what we used to call a blue light nature. You know, it was anything that caused any alarm or was potential of further harm taking place, that we referred. Now, these are all the aspects of a public inquiry or any inquiry that I think people hugely underestimate when they say, let's have a public inquiry, because they're all important. And you have to act out the fairness and objectivity principle very, very carefully. Otherwise, you could have all sorts of legal threats and it wouldn't be proper, because you are supposed to act as the chair and those involved directly in a way that is unimpeachable in that sense.
Thank you.
If I could just add on the process, just to give a demonstration. So for anybody coming to the Truth Project, they would write in, we had teams of psychologists working in the inquiry. Somebody 4 weeks out would hold a online or phone call meeting with them, talk through what evidence would look and feel like, talk through were there any special requirements, did they want to bring somebody with them. They would keep in contact up until the day they came. That same psychiatrist would be there on the day of the session, would meet with them beforehand, would make sure there were no last minute issues, and they would follow up contact for up to 4 weeks afterwards, and then would make sure there was an appropriate handoff to a support service in the local area. And I only say that because that proved to be a very wise decision in quite a lot of cases, because you can imagine how triggering it might be to come and talk yet again to a complete stranger about something that happened to you 30, 40, 50 years ago that you've tried to bury to some extent.
Just, I mean, you would agree there's realms of evidence about best evidence that survivors can give and the appropriate settings and formalities that have to take place, and this shouldn't be done in a slap-handed manner at all. Not just for the victims, protecting victims, but also for them to achieve best evidence.
Yeah. Yes, and indeed we had the same approaches up to a point, as John's described, with all witnesses. Yeah. Some people didn't choose to engage in it, but they were all offered this kind of support.
Thank you.
And then it's Ben, and then I'm coming to bring Robbie in.
Just for the record, the meeting didn't let with Ed Davey. My understanding is, am I right? My understanding other Lib Dem MPs were present at that meeting?
One was, but to be honest, I can't remember precisely. There were certainly one.
I think it was one other MP and three advisors.
You've said, Professor Jay, that the overwhelming message from the victims throughout all of this is just to get it done and not to talk about it or to debate it any further, but just simply implement the recommendations that you made after quite a lengthy statutory inquiry. The theme throughout this hearing today seems to be about implementation and taking responsibility for implementing the recommendations. Where do you think that the responsibility should be to monitor that implementation and actually make sure it happens?
Well, there are different options, and one that has been discussed before was whether a select committee ought to do that, for example. But it is important that it's a combination of individuals with direct experience that can contribute something to it, as well as government representatives or any of those who are charged with actually delivering in whatever way. So that does need to obviously include victims and survivors, the experts, if they have something to specifically to contribute, and government or any of the particular agencies. But there's also the possibility that select committees could do that with the necessary expertise.
Is there also, you said earlier, and rightly, some of the recommendations are implemented and prioritised faster than others.
Yes.
But should, as part of future inquiries, should there be some kind of mandatory implementation timetable which is actually binding on governments to follow and that they can actually be held account on it, rather than this kind of back and forth with ministers and officials, which seems to be sort of quite an optional thing?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, yes, of course, it would help, and certainly we couldn't actually require anything of government, but we did say a response within 6 months would be appropriate, a proper response, and they more or less adhered to that, but unfortunately it wouldn't have made any difference in that case because it was the nature and quality of the response that was weak as far as we were concerned, lacking specificity and timescale. So
reports, and they're supposed to respond within 4 months for those as well, not 6 weeks, is it?
2 months.
2 months, that's it, 2 months, yes. Yes, and we don't always get very good responses.
Yeah, let's go back to what I said earlier, though. There will always be a number of inquiries reporting at the same time. So as well as overseeing to make sure the recommendations were done, the work's got to be done on the ground so that the recommendations that are being overseen are those that are due to be implemented in whatever timetable it is. And the last thing you want is false timetables. So the work that says, if we publish this timetable, how we're going to meet it is really important. It's an obvious thing to say, but we've seen quite a lot of that through the life of the inquiry. There's just been we'll get that done in 6 months, and actually, whichever the organisation has looked at it, that's not been possible. So long as all those things are done, but I think the important point Alexis makes, there needs to be something sitting over the top of that holds government to account and says, why isn't it happen? Why is it not happening?
Brian, you mentioned a couple of times the point around multiple inquiries reporting at the same time. I just wanted to check, were you ever given an impression or told by anybody, yourself or Professor Jay, that other inquiries were taking prominence in terms of bandwidth or parliamentary time or anything like that? Was there any reason why specifically you were told there was a problem with taking forward the recommendations of this particular inquiry?
No, I made the point more because almost no inquiry has had success in getting very many of its recommendations implemented.
Okay.
But even if my point was, even if the government of the day was so inclined, this would be a very long timetable if you had 19 recommendations all requiring different types of primary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can I first start by thanking both of you, particularly yourself, Professor Jay, for your involvement over many, many years and speaking and listening to some incredibly horrendous stories from many victims and survivors. And can I also say that I am deeply, I think frustrated is too light a word, in fact infuriated that not all of the recommendations have been enacted in full, and my reading of the report which you produced, incredibly detailed as it was, is regardless of political party, both nationally and at local levels, this is a failure of the British state at all levels, and indeed anyone with safeguarding responsibilities, to enact their full responsibilities in putting all of your recommendations in full, enacting them in full, as I've been advocating for consistently. So one of the what I'd like to focus on is the challenge of the fact that an incredibly detailed report has been done by yourself. Hopefully we'll be in a position of those recommendations being put in place in full. The report which you carried out was very wide-ranging, quite rightly. Do you feel now that there should be a specific national inquiry that is specifically looking at rape gangs, gang-related grooming, child sexual exploitation in areas, for example, where those concerns have been raised not only in Rotherham but also across the Bradford district, like I've been advocating for?
It's all right, that's just telling us that the business is starting, don't worry. We're not going to all run and vote.
I think I made my own position clear a couple of weeks ago that I certainly at this point do not think there should be a national inquiry. I certainly thought obviously a local inquiry would be justified, but not a national public inquiry. Having just spent years and years on it. But actually, there were for different reasons. First of all, there was a discussion that said, well, I can't remember where it originated, but at the beginning of all this, there was a view that perhaps the recommendations should be further delayed. Now, clearly, I wasn't going to agree to or support anything that said that. But however, beyond that, I simply do not understand, and I do have the experience of Rotherham to go on as well. It's just more of concern to me that victims and survivors will not necessarily have their aspirations met by a public inquiry unless they know a little more about the processes involved and how lengthy anything on the nature of a public inquiry could be. And also, it simply does not, I hear so often, people will be brought to justice, but they can't be by the public inquiry. I mean, it doesn't have that power.
So there's an acknowledgement that, quite rightly, your report was very wide-ranging, on the assumption that this government enact the full recommendations, which I can understand the frustration that you've had, that they have not been put in place fully. So let's assume that that is the aspiration of this government and they are done at speed. Is there not a possibility to have a twin-tracked process, to have a national inquiry when there are concerns of over 50 towns, like Rotherham, like Telford, like the Bradford district that's never had a spotlight shone on it, that actually, by just having a hodgepodge approach, by having very in-depth local inquiries, that you are not then actually getting the full picture when you're specifically looking at the challenges associated with rape gangs, gang-related grooming, child sexual exploitation?
Well, you may be right, but on the other hand, in the CSE investigation that we carried out, we were very clear that this wasn't a problem on the wane at all, and people were treating it as if it were a problem that was going away when it wasn't, and we said that in the report, and the data was awful. You know, I would rather we allowed the proposed exercises on data to be in place to see if we could better understand the picture from facts. It would be nice if people actually, you know, relied on some facts for a change and numbers, and took some of the aspects out of all of this that I've found distasteful. And I agree with you that it should be a matter that it does not attract specific political involvement. It's about children, and it has to be about children.
Which is why I'm specifically saying there's been failure at a political level on all political parties. I've been quite clear on that consistently for a long period of time. But can you I just want to dig a little bit deeper on why we would not want to provide more openness, more transparency on having a national inquiry specifically that looks at this issue. Because can I just propose a challenge to you that I'm faced with? So across the Bradford district, we've never had a local inquiry. We've never had any spotlight that's been shone on it. There was a weak report that was produced in 2021 that had 50 pages long, looked at some horrendous child sexual exploitation, gang rapes of only 5 children, and concluded that children remain unprotected while some perpetrators remain unknown and remain unchallenged. We know across the Bradford district that just only last week 8 men were convicted for gang rape in Keighley. In February 22, 4 men were convicted of gang rape from Keighley. February 2016, 12 men were convicted of gang rape. In 2015, 11 men, all of British Pakistani heritage, some of them being second generation. So when these challenges have been posed and no spotlight has been shone on a local area, and you have refusals of local leadership to allow that spotlight to take place, and that it's not just happening across the Bradford district, is it not just that the national government should step in when there are concerns being raised at that local level to do the right thing, in my view, of having a national inquiry that looks very specifically on these individual areas across the UK? If there are concerns over 50 different towns, that collectively that should be the right approach. So we are doing justice in the sense of not only leading to convictions, but installing trust back in the system by those victims, those survivors, in the very state that has failed them.
It's not particularly a debate I wish to enter into at this stage, but I would suggest, clearly, we found this in our reports and CSE as well, that there are many police forces who simply don't prioritise this. they should get on and do that. Their problem profiling should be hugely better than it currently is, and more hugely improved profiling, and the need to prioritise it is central to what you've just said, and obviously in bringing to justice the criminals that you're describing. It's just not very clear how that fits with what a public inquiry can actually do, unless you. I don't know what the Inspectorate of Constabulary has already done, for example, latterly, or have they done enough? Or I cannot easily see a lengthy and expensive public inquiry necessarily being able to do what you're describing.
Can I just ask why you chose six different towns or geographical areas to focus on? None of them were in West Yorkshire. None of them were in South Yorkshire. In fact, the only two in the north were Durham and St Helens. Just why did you? One of them was Warwickshire, for example. Why those six? And therefore, building on that. Given the level of concern that had been raised.
We're very, very keen to find out, not to visit those areas which had already been the subject of reviews. We wanted to be sure that we were looking at what was being done. We were absolutely clear that this was not a problem that was diminishing at all, but we wanted to verify, take account of what was actually going on in those areas and being done to be either, well, preventive would be good, but certainly even if not that, at least to identify those in those particular areas where the group activity was going on. And this may sound like an argument in your favour, but it's not particularly necessarily. But we read case files in these areas, and we were able to identify there were several
Can I just
children.
And did you read any case files across Keighley or the Bradford district as part of it?
No. I'm talking about the 6 areas.
Oh right, sorry. Yeah.
But in those areas, 2 of them had reported there being no organised networks that they were aware of. This is through the police. There were 2 of them indicated that. Now, we read case files that indicated clearly children were being sexually exploited. And now there's an obvious mismatch there. We could reasonably expect that might be the case in a number of other areas, that the police work is not being fully undertaken comprehensively to identify these networks as it should be, and it isn't.
And I completely agree with what you've just said, which is why the level of concern that I have is so strong, particularly around those areas that, like the Bradford district, that have not had a spotlight on them. The Home Secretary gave a statement to the House last week, announcing effectively 5 audits that are going to take place. Do you think that is going far enough when they will not be statutory, they will not have the ability to compel witnesses to come forward? And I'd just like you to expand a little bit more on the specifics of the Home Secretary's announcement. If you're more favourable for a local inquiry to take place, actually is the Home Secretary's announcement going far enough?
I don't know. I don't know enough about those particular areas to be able to comment on that. And it's absolutely necessary to know something about local areas, but you can also generalise from the kind of information that we found. I mean, case file reading is the easiest way into knowing how the issue is being responded to.
So just focusing on if you're not at this stage agreeable to a national inquiry, I just want to come back to my area that I've been talking about for a long time, the Bradford district. So how is it best to achieve a local inquiry across an area like Bradford, where at the current position we do not have the local leadership on Bradford Council willing for that inquiry to take place. And we also have our West Yorkshire Mayor, and indeed her Deputy Mayor for Policing, also saying very publicly this is not a Bradford problem, this is a national problem. So how do we break this barrier if the national government is not willing to enforce a statutory inquiry that compels witnesses, that will lead to convictions, like we've seen in Rochdale, for example, where the mayor in Manchester did the right thing? How do we break this challenge when concerns, valid concerns, are not only being raised by members of Parliament like me, but indeed local victims and survivors? Should this not be a duty of the government to step in and force statutory inquiries at a local level?
Well, I mean, you have some views about this, John, which may be relevant here about trying to get a meld of the two, if you like. But I can only refer to my own experience in Rotherham. That was some years ago. That was non-statutory. It was not expensive, and it took 10 months.
Yeah.
And
But that was with the will of Rotherham Council to do that.
I was just coming on to that,
Yeah.
yes, but it was with the will of them, but it took a lot of, I understand, it took a lot of persuasion that this was the right thing to do. But ultimately, the people are persuaded, as I've learned in this a lot, is that they're generally persuaded by bad publicity.
Okay.
To do things on, if they won't do it because it's the right thing to do, then sometimes bad publicity will set. I mean, I have heard it said in other places, and I think I may have even quoted it in the report that we produced, that we will not be another Rotherham. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but that we will not be. In other words, there'll be a kind of collusion not to commission such report. I'm simply giving you a possible explanation. I have no idea if it applies, but I know that it has applied in other places, that by having an inquiry you might actually be causing the area to be represented in a way that's not desirable.
Mm-hmm. And finally, from me, you, in an earlier answer, you indicated actually the weight of this committee has the ability to shine a spotlight on these challenges. Is there any advice that you would like to give us as a committee beyond today, specifically on this issue, given the level of concerns that I've raised, not only at a local level, but at national, in terms of what additional questions we should be asking others beyond yourself?
I'm happy to assist in any way that is helpful to the committee. So if you have any further questions, of course, I would be more than happy to try to address them.
Thank you.
Paul Kohler and then Sean Davis.
There might clearly be a case for another national inquiry if their systemic issues hadn't been addressed by your report, but your contention is presumably you have addressed those systemic issues, or you are seeking to address those systemic issues with your recommendations. Is that correct?
Yes, and there are a lot of recommendations across the piece on child sexual abuse that are also relevant to CSE. Of course they are. You know, the recommendations are not exclusively for children who have been abused in schools or the church or whatever. They are equally, in terms of the behaviours, they're equally applicable to CSE.
And you talk about some police forces not prioritising this type of crime. Would the presence of another national inquiry be likely to encourage them, or would it give them another excuse for not prioritising it?
Well, I don't know. David Cameron announced made it a policing priority in 2015. But whether anybody's actually confirmed that it's actually happening, I don't know. Maybe a question to ask.
Something for this committee as well. Sean Davis.
One of the key differences between a national statutory inquiry and a non-statutory national or non-statutory local inquiry that's been spoke about quite a lot is the inability for a local non-statutory inquiry to compel people to come and give evidence. Certainly in my experience in the inquiry, we ended up commissioning in Telford because the government didn't want to commission a specific inquiry, was that people didn't come forward that the inquiry wanted to talk to, and that those are detailed in the report. Did you have the ability for you to have that ability to compel in the national inquiry? Was that a useful tool to you as a national chair? And have you got any views, yourself, Professor, or yourself, Mr. O'Brien, in terms of the ability for local areas to have that type of ability to compel?
It's difficult to know because we don't know what it would have been like without it. Nevertheless, there were a small number of occasions when it was essential. Some people just think if they don't reply to contact that you'll just go away. Now that never happened in the public inquiry which I chaired, and nor in any public inquiry, because we were fairly ruthless in pursuing individuals, and if they said they were sick or something, they had to give us a medical certificate, and by the way, we'll be seeing you in another, when you're better, sort of thing. If that was true, we used tracing agencies to track people down to make sure that just a wrong address or whatever was not good enough, or whether it was deliberate or accidental. So there are quite a lot of ways in which you don't have to resort to sending the police round, but you could if you needed to. There were only a couple of occasions where we really had to push it with a threat that we could prosecute if they didn't cooperate. But mostly you have to do all the other things first, of course, and it was certainly helpful in some cases, but I can't say that accounted for an awful lot. In the beginning, we, of course, told everybody does this in the public inquiry, you say, do not destroy any materials, but it doesn't matter what kind of inquiry it is, they could still do it, and because you wouldn't know what you didn't know, as it were, and sometimes there were witnesses to that which we were aware of, and we'd bring them in, deliberate destruction of records. But it has been useful, but it doesn't constitute, in our experience, doesn't constitute a huge part of it, partly because it's very hard to validate necessarily going back in time.
Thank you. And just on that follow-up point, either one or both of you, in terms of that the ability for local inquiries either to exercise that or apply to an authority in circumstances where they feel the need to. Obviously, there's the duty of candour through Hillsborough that's coming through. Just your views on that would be really helpful.
So, I personally don't believe the duty of candour will make a huge amount of difference, if I'm honest. I see a duty of candour that already exists, particularly in places like the NHS, and it appears to me that it's not hugely effective, so I remain unconvinced that a duty of candour will do that. We're into the sphere of personal opinions now, but having spent this long in a national inquiry, Alexis is quite right. It's a tiny percentage of people that you need to go to compulsion with. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. Most people do come forward and do give you the full evidence, and you can tell. You get 80 files, and one of them refers to file 85. So you know quite quickly the people that you're going to need to compel. Having said that, I do think, being a real geek, that there should be a look at the Inquiries Act to see if the ability to call what we currently describe as a national statutory inquiry, but let's take the word national out. A statutory inquiry should perhaps to be devolved a bit further. Maybe regional mayors. I think going too local would mean that it might get misused, but I do think that given the change in regional mayors didn't exist when the Inquiries Act was written, I do think there's a case for looking at whether the ability to compel should now only sit solely with ministers, or whether there is a case. I think then you just have to distinguish that if you do that, then it's up to that regional mayor to agree and fund it. But I do think that might give the ability for cases such as Mr. Moore was talking about to try and persuade at a local level. and then you'd have the full weight of what would effectively now be called a national statutory inquiry.
Thank you.
Conscious we're running out of time. I've got Jake Richards and then I'm going to Margaret, Joni, Robbie and Ben. So quick questions please.
Very briefly. My constituency is on the outskirts of Rotherham, and clearly after your report and Baroness Casey's report, there has been great progress in Rotherham, and the children's services is there's still great challenges, and you never let your eye off the ball, but there's been a lot of progress. What's the best mechanism for where progress has been made, equally in Telford and other areas, following light being shone, using Robbie's phrase, of sharing that on a national basis?
Well, there's the Centre for Expertise in the government funds on child sexual abuse. So I suppose that would be an obvious outlet, and perhaps, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to criticise it, it's just I simply don't know what their outputs are, and whether that kind of, improving practice example, it's certainly worth doing. Of course it is, because people are searching for ways to address this across the country, across the UK. I mean, it is important, and I was aware that certainly a number of improvements had taken place, and of course that was all with it was one of the outcomes, all of that, of a non-statutory inquiry which I conducted, and of course it did refer to the, as you obviously know, to the NCA took over what became Operation Stovewood.
Do you have confidence that the data on ethnicity that will now be collected, how do you think that would help with prevention, if at all?
Well, first of all, ethnicity should be the ethnicity of the victims as well as the, of the perpetrators. I hope it would contribute to some of the discussions that, where a factual basis for whatever's being said would be helpful, absolutely helpful, one way or another, because at the moment this whole debate is rampant with all sorts of disinformation and statements that are made, and we need to know the basic information. I would also add, by the way, that it's really important that things like disability should be included, and whether a child is in residential care, because these are two important issues that are not counted. They might be, but they're not required to be counted at the moment in anything to do with victims, and these are predisposing factors. So all round, a better single code data set which is accurately reporting would have a great deal to contribute.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I add to that a bit? Yeah. Can I come back to something Mr. Moore said? In the 6 areas that we looked at, 2 of them reported that they had not only no grooming gangs, but almost no instances of organised child sexual abuse at all. But of course they did, they just didn't record it. And I go back to my earlier point, this was not about ethnicity, this was about the recording of what had actually taken place. So what was recorded was generic abuse, not sexual abuse. And so some of Alexis's concerns around the questions about a local versus statutory inquiry, I'm confused as to what it might expose, because it would expose different things in different areas, in my view, depending on the quality of the data that is available to underpin it. So I think if we do one thing now to start improving our understanding of wider abuse, but particularly the issue at question, is to start getting that data collection and the recording of accurate data in place. Because if you go up and down the country, I've no doubt at all you will find areas that have all sorts of grooming gangs, and there will be all sorts of ethnicity involved depending on the area you look at. But what will be missing is the can you properly quantify it, because the data won't support it. So I do think that the areas we looked at, they looked us in the eye and said we don't have any. They didn't for one moment think it was because they weren't doing things they should be doing. And data throughout our inquiry was the bane of our lives, that being able to get hold of accurate, reliable data on the quantity of sexual abuse across the piece was a nightmare, to be honest with you.
Just very quickly, Just on the reporting is absolutely vital, based on the complexity of what is being reported. Completely agree. But it is also important, is it not, that the ethnicity of the perpetrator is also recorded, as well as the ethnicity of the victim.
Yeah.
And therefore, then building on that, why that then additional challenge exists.
I was merely making the point: if you record the ethnicity but not the crime, if you like, you get an accurate picture of what is actually occurring. You might understand more about ethnicity, but you still won't have a complete picture of is it sexual abuse or is it general abuse. Does that make sense? Because very often sexual crimes, it's very rarely the other way around. Very often sexual crimes are recorded as general abuse.
Jamie.
Having standard baseline data across sexual in Wales is important, but would you agree that for it to be maximally effective, that you would want that standard database across the UK, including in Scotland and Northern Ireland? My understanding is that Police Scotland doesn't record ethnicity either in terms of perpetrators or victims, and it's equally a problem for Police Scotland. And would you agree that we need to collect that data, have a standard data set across our nations? Maybe.
Well,
it's gold standard stuff, and we're far away from it.
It is difficult enough, and indeed I'm straying into another area here, but nevertheless, when we talk about child criminal exploitation, it's a huge issue because it crosses boundaries all the time.
Exactly.
And indeed, even if we talked about modern slavery, which has emerged much more in the last few years, not just in child criminal exploitation, but also in sexual exploitation, there's a lot of transferability and crossing of boundaries. I mean, that would be ideal, but I'm not sure how long it would take to get agreement on it.
Well, that's a shame because it's so important, and it's not that much to ask, is it, that we have a standard data.
There are political arguments, I'm sure, about it all, but
sadly,
to standardise the recording of children who've gone missing, so
yes.
it's a complete, it's different everywhere, and even within forces it's
right.
different.
That's so important.
Very important. Ben Maguire.
Just to summarise then, I was wondering if either of you had any reflections. We've obviously talked a lot about the implementation process and timescales, but if you just have any further reflections on the independent inquiry process and the relationship with the government, and any recommendations or suggestions that we haven't yet covered.
I don't think I have anything further to add to what we've already, or I've already said about any of that, because there really shouldn't be a relationship. If it's a proper independent inquiry, it should be independent of everybody at that stage, throughout it. Although there is a point for certain kind of, we use government data all the time and whatever else, but at a more formal level, I think it would undermine the independence. That needs to be independent and fair to all participants, including government, of course, because there's some people who were in every inquiry, for example. But I don't think I have anything to add to the hugely important issue that we've already discussed about monitoring arrangements.
I think getting the terms of reference right at the beginning, I'm not suggesting there has one, but I think sometimes the discussion on the terms of reference is perhaps not as deep as it should be, and getting that right at the beginning, which doesn't impinge on the independence of the inquiry. But I keep coming back to, we spent nearly £187 million, and here we are talking about 2.5 years when nothing's happened. And I genuinely feel that had even the data we've been talking about being in place, you'd have a slightly different conversation about the issue at the moment. So I just think, I'll go back to what I said, that the Inquiries Act was written in 2005. It hasn't really been updated since. I think it needs a long, hard look at to say, is it still relevant, given the changes that have happened since.
Sean.
Just picking up that point, and you have mentioned it, but just to be very clear, there's definitely a distinction between the independence that you need as a chair and as an inquiry on the setting up and the investigating piece. But sure, there's a distinction then with once recommendations have been reported, and go back to the Telford local inquiry that we commissioned, as part of that process, the independent chair came back, I think it was a year on, to effectively inspect progress. Do you feel that that could be something that's built into future inquiries, where the actual people who do the investigation are asked to go back at an appropriate time to measure progress? I think you mentioned, didn't you, that had happened elsewhere. I just wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, I think there's absolutely a case for those who have been involved to come back, because you have an understanding of what the intention was fully. But there's also scope for others to contribute to that kind of assessment, if you like, and we'd say victims and survivors ought to be involved from the local area or wherever the subject, the locality is that you're talking about, or the school or whatever. But definitely there has to be a little more latitude where to bring in others, but people who are directly affected or who are working in that environment or whatever, definitely. Yes.
Thank you.
One final question from me. Do you have any indication around the redress scheme? Has that been agreed by the government, and when that might be implemented?
Nobody has. I seem to remember one meeting we were at with Ms. Braverman, and it was only one meeting where redress was raised. And nobody's discussed redress with us since then.
I can only take it as read that the statement last week said all 20 have been accepted, so I can only take it as read that that is implicit.
So we can make more inquiries on that. Can I thank you both for your time? We have gone slightly over our allocated time. I do apologise for that, but you can see there was so many questions that we had. And I also want to thank you for all the work that you did. It's a long process, and it was incredibly thorough and detailed. So thank you for your dedication to doing that. With that, I will close the proceedings of the official part of this meeting with order. Thank you.